There's a receipt sitting in a filing cabinet at the National Archives that most Americans have never seen. Not a receipt for something purchased, a receipt for something surrendered. April 19th, 1933, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, $20 gold piece, weight 0.967 ounces, value $20.67, payment $20.67 in paper currency. At the bottom, in typewritten letters, quote, 0. A researcher found it while cataloging Depression-era banking records. Thousands of identical receipts, filing box after filing box, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, every Federal Reserve District, millions of transactions, all with the same word, surrendered. Most Americans don't know that Executive Order 6102 exists. It was signed on April 5th, 1933, 32 days after Franklin Roosevelt took office. The order gave Americans 25 days to turn in their gold. All of it, coins, bars, certificates, everything. The penalty for noncompliance was 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. That's $150,000 in today's money for keeping your own property. By October of 1933, 16 million ounces had been collected. Approximately 400 tons of gold moved from private hands into Federal Reserve vaults. Then 9 months later, the government changed the price from $20.67 per ounce to $35, a 70% revaluation. Overnight, Americans who surrendered their gold in May got paid $20.67. By January of 1934, that same ounce was officially worth $35. The government didn't compensate anyone for the difference. This is where the textbooks stop. They explain the order as an emergency measure during the Depression, a temporary sacrifice for economic stability. But here's what those textbooks don't explain, and the sequence, the exemptions, and who actually lost versus who kept theirs. To understand what happened in 1933, you need to understand what gold represented before that year. Since 1792, the United States operated on a gold standard. $1 equaled 24.75 grains of pure gold. Paper money wasn't symbolic. It was a certificate redeemable for actual metal. Walk into a bank with a $20 bill. The bank was legally required to exchange it for a $20 gold coin. This created a natural limit. The government couldn't print more currency without acquiring more gold. The system anchored money to physical reality. By 1933, American citizens privately held an estimated $400 million in gold. Families kept coins in safes. Banks stored certificates. Wealth wasn't just numbers. It was weight you could hold. Then in 1 month, the government demanded all of it back. Reasonable. The Depression had triggered bank runs. Citizens were hoarding gold, draining reserves. Emergency action was necessary to stabilize the banking system. Reasonable, except for one detail. The order specifically exempted foreign central banks and international financial institutions. Foreign governments could still hold gold in American vaults. American citizens could not. If the crisis was about hoarding, why exempt the largest holders? But this was only the beginning. Executive Order 6102 included carefully worded exemptions. Gold coins having recognized special value to collectors, gold used in industry and the arts, gold held for legitimate and customary use in profession or business. Reasonable. You can't confiscate dental gold or industrial materials needed for manufacturing. Reasonable, except the definitions were deliberately vague. What qualifies as a rare coin? Pre-1863? Foreign? Proof sets? The order didn't specify. What counts as industrial use? A dentist keeps gold for dental work. How much? A jeweler keeps gold for production. What quantity? An artist keeps gold for gilding. What limit? The order never defined the terms. So two things happened. Ordinary Americans, terrified of federal prison, surrendered everything, even family heirlooms, even coins that might have qualified as collectibles. They didn't want to risk a trial to argue definitions, but wealthy individuals consulted lawyers. They identified loopholes. They navigated the exemptions. Foreign investors ignored the order entirely. There are no comprehensive records of who kept what. The Treasury didn't track exemptions individually, but the pattern is visible in what happened next. William Campbell was a wheat farmer outside Salina, Kansas. His grandfather left him $300 in gold coins when he passed in 1928, double eagles, $20 pieces minted between 1850 and 1907. Some dated back to the California gold rush. In May of 1933, William walked into the First National Bank of Salina and surrendered all of them. The teller gave him $300 in paper currency, one for one exchange. William asked if the coins qualified as rare. The teller said he didn't know. William didn't want to risk it. 9 months later, those coins were officially worth $510. William got $300 in paper. He never saw the difference. And because the coins were surrendered, melted, and absorbed into Treasury reserves, there's no way to know if they actually qualified for the rare coin exemption. The evidence was destroyed, but here's what makes the system perfect. The order didn't just confiscate gold, it transferred the risk of noncompliance entirely onto citizens. If you kept gold and it didn't qualify for exemption, you faced prison. If you surrendered gold that did qualify, you lost it anyway. The safest choice was to surrender everything and ask no questions. Compliance was driven by fear, not clarity. Publicly, the government threatened 10 years in federal prison. In practice, almost no one was prosecuted. The most documented case involved Frederick Barber Campbell, a New York lawyer who challenged the order in court, arguing it was unconstitutional. He lost. The case went to the Supreme Court, which declined to hear it. Campbell's gold was seized, but he was never imprisoned. Another case involved a safe deposit box in Manhattan containing 27 gold bars. Discovered during a bank audit in 1935, the Treasury seized the bars. No prosecution, no trial, just confiscation. Isolated reports exist of small fines and seizures throughout the 30s, but no verified cases of anyone serving significant prison time for holding gold. Why? Because trials create public records. Public records create scrutiny. The government needed compliance, not controversy. The threat of imprisonment was enough. Most surrendered without question. The few who didn't were quietly dealt with through civil seizure, and the gold flowed into Treasury vaults. Reasonable, except when you line up the sequence. April 5th, 1933, Executive Order 6102 issued, economic emergency declared, gold hoarding blamed for bank failures. May 1st, 1933, compliance deadline, 16 million ounces surrendered in 6 months. January 30th, 1934, Gold Reserve Act signed. All gold transferred from Federal Reserve to U.S. Treasury. Price reset from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. 70% revaluation. No compensation to citizens who complied. Not coincidence. Pattern. But the confiscation wasn't isolated to the United States. The same year, Britain effectively abandoned the gold standard. France followed in 1936. The entire international monetary system was being restructured, and the nation with the largest centralized gold reserve controlled the new system. By 1934, the United States government held more gold than any other entity in the world. American citizens could no longer own monetary gold. Foreign governments could. This arrangement remained in place for 41 years. July of 1944. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 nations gather at the Mount Washington Hotel. They establish a new global monetary system. The U.S. dollar becomes the world reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce, but only foreign central banks can redeem dollars for gold. American citizens still cannot. The gold Americans surrendered in 1933 became the foundation for a system that gave the U.S. government control over international currency for decades. The Treasury used that gold to guarantee the dollar. The dollar became the global standard, and American citizens, the original owners, were locked out. It wasn't until December 31st, 1974, that President Gerald Ford signed legislation allowing Americans to own gold again, 41 years after confiscation. By that time, 2 generations had grown up never knowing private gold ownership. The connection between currency and physical wealth had been severed in the public mind. Money was paper, paper was money. The idea that currency should represent something tangible had been erased. And the price? In 1933, gold was confiscated at $20.67 per ounce. When private ownership was restored in 1975, gold was trading at over $180 per ounce, 9 times higher. Those who complied in 1933 and received $20 in paper lost everything. Those who found ways to keep theirs through exemptions or simply by hiding it watched it increase ninefold over 40 years. Maybe the timing is coincidental. Maybe each decision, independent of the others, was reasonable. Emergency measures during crisis, international cooperation during war, gradual liberalization after stability returned, but then I look at who actually benefited, and the coincidence becomes harder to accept. Law firms specializing in rare coin exemptions tripled their fees between 1933 and 1935. Banks that held gold for European clients reported record deposits. The Mellon family, which controlled significant banking interests and whose patriarch Andrew Mellon served as Treasury Secretary until 1932, held extensive rare coin collections that were never surrendered. J.P. Morgan and Company, which had close ties to the Federal Reserve and the Roosevelt administration, maintained gold reserves for international clients throughout the period. The wealthy who understood the system kept their gold. The working class who trusted the government surrendered theirs. And 9 months later, the government announced the gold was worth 70% more than they paid for it. This is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. There's a photograph from May of 1933 outside the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. The line stretches around the block, families holding cloth bags, some crying. The photo was taken on May 1st, the compliance deadline, last chance to avoid federal prison. You can see their faces. A man in a worn suit, hat pulled low, a woman clutching a purse to her chest, an elderly couple, the man's hand on his wife's shoulder. They're not there to make a transaction. They're there to surrender property their families held for generations, because that's what gold represented before 1933. Generational wealth. In grandfather's double eagle passed to his son, then to his grandson. Wedding gifts, inheritances, savings that survived the panic of 1893, the recession of 1907, the crash of 1929, metal that held value when paper didn't. And in 25 days, it was gone. William Campbell wasn't the only one. There were tens of thousands like him across every state. Farmers in Iowa who surrendered coins their fathers earned clearing land in the 1880s. Shopkeepers in Georgia who turned in savings from decades of business. Immigrants in New York who brought gold from Europe, their only security in a new country. Gone. The official estimate is 16 million ounces surrendered, but that number doesn't capture what was actually lost. It was the last tangible connection to a monetary system that existed before the Federal Reserve, before fiat currency, before the government could simply declare wealth redistribution by executive order. Because here's what nobody discusses. The families who surrendered gold in 1933 didn't just lose 70% of its value when the government revalued it 9 months later. They lost the ability to protect themselves from every future devaluation. When the government prints more money, gold holds value. Paper doesn't. The families who kept gold, legally or otherwise, were insulated from inflation for the next 40 years. The families who complied and took paper watched it lose purchasing power every single year. By 1980, when gold hit $600 per ounce, that $20 gold piece William Campbell surrendered would have been worth 30 times what he was paid for it. He got $20 in paper. 47 years later, that $20 bill was worth maybe $4 in 1933 purchasing power. The metal would have been worth $600, but William couldn't have known that in May of 1933. He was standing in line at a bank in Kansas, holding coins his grandfather gave him, trying to decide if the risk of keeping them was worth 10 years in federal prison. He made the choice the government knew most Americans would make. He trusted the system. And there were millions like him, ordinary people who believed that compliance was the right thing to do, that the government wouldn't lie about the value of what it was taken, that the emergency was real and temporary. Some of them are still alive, not many, but there are Americans in their 90s today whose parents or grandparents told them stories about surrendering gold in 1933, about standing in those lines, about the feeling of walking out of a bank with paper, knowing they'd just given away something that couldn't be printed, and when those last witnesses are gone, the only evidence will be the receipts. thousands of them, filed in boxes at the National Archives, each one a record of a transaction that was legal, authorized, and catastrophically one-sided. Despite the confiscation, traces remain. There's a box at the National Archives, Record Group 56, Entry 360, Executive Order 6102 compliance records, 16 million receipts. Most have never been digitized. Most have never been reviewed. Each receipt contains a name, a date, a Federal Reserve District, and an amount. 16 million data points documenting who surrendered what and when, the evidence of the largest wealth transfer in American history preserved in a filing cabinet. The receipts are still there. Anyone can request access. The language survives too. We still say underscore, quote, underscore, zero underscore, even though the dollar hasn't been backed by anything since 1971. We still call it cold hard cash, even though cash is paper. We still use the phrase worth its weight in gold as the ultimate measure of value. The expressions remember what the documents tried to erase. There are families who kept their receipts not in archives, in homes, tucked in Bibles, stored in attics, passed down with the explicit instruction to never forget what happened. Some kept them as evidence, some kept them as warnings, some kept them because their grandparents told them that one day someone would ask what really happened in 1933, and the receipts would be the only proof. The coins themselves are harder to trace. Most were melted, absorbed into treasury reserves, turned into bars and stored in Fort Knox. But not all of them. The U.S. Mint records show that between 1933 and 1937, millions of gold coins were not melted. They were held in reserve. Some were later released to collectors. Some vanished into private hands through unknown channels. There are double eagles from the 1800s still in circulation today, still bought and sold in rare coin markets, and every single one raises a question. How did it survive? Was it legitimately exempted? Was it hidden? Was it stolen? The paper trail is incomplete, but the metal persists. And then there are the court cases. Frederick Barber Campbell's challenge to Executive Order 6102 created a legal record. His argument that the government cannot confiscate private property without due process is documented in court transcripts. He lost, but the argument remains. Legal scholars still cite Campbell's case when discussing the limits of executive power. The precedent has never been overturned, which means that legally, under the right emergency conditions, the same confiscation could happen again. The law remembers what the textbooks don't teach, so the evidence exists in archives, in language, in families, in court records, in the coins that somehow survived, scattered, fragmented, mostly ignored, but there. And once you know where to look, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Let me walk through this one more time, because each step individually seems defensible. April 1933, economic crisis. Gold hoarding destabilizes banks. Government acts to protect the system. Reasonable. May 1933, citizens surrender gold. They receive paper at official exchange rate, fair transaction. Reasonable. January 1934, government revalues gold 70% higher. This strengthens the dollar, supports recovery. Reasonable. July 1944, Bretton Woods establishes dollar as global reserve currency, backed by gold. Americans surrendered. This stabilizes post-war economies. Reasonable. December 1974, private ownership restored after crisis passes and the system worked. Reasonable. But here's what actually happened. Wealth transferred from citizens to government without legislative approval, without compensation, through executive order. The transfer disproportionately affected ordinary Americans who complied out of fear. Exemptions allowed elites and foreign entities to keep theirs. The revaluation created immediate profit for Treasury. No one who surrendered received the difference. The gold became foundation for monetary control that lasted 41 years. By the time ownership was restored, 2 generations had forgotten what money used to mean. That receipt at the National Archives, April 19th, 1933, $20 gold piece, surrendered, $20.67 paid. Today, that same ounce of gold trades for over $2,000. The man who surrendered it got $20 in paper. The paper is still worth $20. The metal increased 100-fold. The receipts, remember. The archives preserve what the textbooks erase. And somewhere in those 16 million documented transactions, there's a pattern that can't be explained by economic emergency alone. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The question isn't whether it happened. The receipts prove it happened. The question is why we're still pretending it was about saving the economy when the evidence shows it was about deciding who controls wealth and how that control is justified.